Hi everybody and welcome to this VikingGenetics webinar. Tonight we're going to tackle inbreeding depression with heterosis, ProCROSS crossbreeding as a solution. Part of tonight's presentation will cover inbreeding depression and its consequences, what is heterosis, benefits of structured crossbreeding system, and the key strategies for an optimal crossbreeding plan. Before we pass across to the main presentation, just a couple of housekeepings. The webinar will be recorded and sent to all participants by email. Everyone within the webinar is muted, so you're unable to actually physically speak during the webinar, but do feel free to use the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner. And if you have any questions that come to mind during the webinar, please submit those in the questions box again down in the bottom right hand corner. We've booked some time afterwards for a Q&A session after the presentation. If we run out of time to answer all questions, we will ensure that we send replies to the participants after the webinar. I'd like to introduce the speaker for this webinar is Amy Hazel Loeschke. She has a PhD, she's our PhD ProCROSS Product Consultant at ProCROSS and Corrective Genetics of California in the USA. And she focused on identifying new ways how ProCROSS enhances profit and improves the sustainability of dairy farms. Amy worked as a researcher at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and was the first author of a 10-year design crossbreeding experiment in Minnesota commercial dairy herds. So I'd like to now pass across to Amy, who will take us through her presentation.
Thank you very much, Matt. Give me a second here to share my screen with you all. Okay, I think we're set to go. Yeah, great to be here with you all, and thanks for tuning in. I'm going to jump right into today's content here with you. I usually like to save my conclusions for the very end of the talk, but today I'm actually going to lead off with my conclusions because I think it's really important to emphasize where the content in this talk is headed and why it's important to talk about inbreeding and hybrid vigor. So just to say right out the door, crossbreeding today is more relevant than it's ever been before. And the reason for that is because we should be concerned as an industry, but also as pure breeders and commercial dairy farmers, that inbreeding is higher than it's ever been before. And we don't really see any tapering off of that rate of increase in our purebred populations, particularly the global breed, the Holstein breed, that you'll notice I'm going to pick on quite a bit today. For a couple of reasons. It is the global breed that we kind of benchmark everything against. It's also the breed that we have the most data on globally, so that makes it easy to use as the comparison point. The second point we're going to talk a lot about is this concept of hybrid vigor or heterosis. And we see that it's as effective as it's ever been in history due to these high levels of inbreeding and within breed genetic similarity. So I'm going to get into those points as we go along here. Before I dive in deeper, I want to go through a couple terms here that I'm going to use over and over again in today's talk. The first is inbreeding depression. Now you can think of inbreeding depression as a reduction in the fitness or the function of an organism, plant or animal, and it's caused by the breeding of related individuals. And so by that I mean a mother and a father, a sire and a dam. When we breed them together and they have some sort of relationship, that's when we see this reduction of fitness in their offspring. An example here is this picture I'm showing about inbreeding depression in dogs. And in these golden retrievers, the reduction of fitness is that we're losing the size of the litter when those parents are related. Now, the flip side of that is hybrid vigor or heterosis. I use these two terms interchangeably. They mean the same thing, and you'll probably catch me using both interchangeably throughout the rest of this hour with you. You can think of hybrid vigor as the improved function of an offspring over the average of its parents. So here in this photo, I'm showing you the cherry tomato example. We have two parents on either sides of this photo, and you'll see that one parent is pretty small and puny and with a modest amount of fruit produced here. Over on this side, we have a pretty big plant with a kind of a puny amount of fruit produced by this parent. But what happens when we cross them into this hybrid offspring? Wow, look at all of the productivity that these two parents produce. The other thing that I really like about this photo is that this intermediate offspring here is intermediate in size between the top and the bottom parent and produces a whole lot more fruit compared to the size of the plant itself. And so I think that relates really well to what we see in our dairy cattle breeds. We don't necessarily need the biggest cow and the most sizable features in order to have a lot of productivity produced for dairy cattle either. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few different mating systems here to start us off. We can go from the furthest to the left here, an inbreeding or line breeding example. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. As we move to the right, we have different within breed mating systems of different types here. Random mating within breeds can be thought of just putting semen into cows. You have 10 cows in heat today. We pick a cane of semen out of the tank. We just blindly breed them. You might be surprised to hear that that is the most common mating system used in the United States right now. That's the production system that I've lived in my whole life. And here where we have a lot of big herds, that's typically how cows are bred. And it's unfortunate because this causes more of the inbreeding problem as we move to the left on this continuum than it does helping with the outcrossing that we see over here. But within this mating cluster, you can think of these other types of within breed matings as being very similar along this continuum. So we have mating among similar breeds. This can be something like Friesian and Holstein, for example. Yes, maybe some marketers will say, oh, they're different things. They'll give you lots of hybrid vigor, just like crossing. But really, they're very close in genetic relationship, so they're the same as a within breed mating. Then we have corrective mating with inbreeding prevention. And a lot of you who use a mating plan to breed your cattle would fit into this category. So we're still using within breed systems, but trying to prevent those really high peaks of inbreeding. Then we come over here to crossing of distinct breeds. And that's what you see in an example like ProCROSS, where we have 3 distinct breeds that we're intentionally crossing in order to create high levels of heterosis. On the right side of the continuum, you can think of crossing of species. I'm not going to talk about that today because it doesn't have a lot of context for milk production. But you can think of this example as, like, for example, this mule here, the crossing of a horse and a donkey. Another example would be a beefalo is sometimes seen in the United States. The crossing of a beef cow and American bison, for example, would be another situation of that. But the thing I want to emphasize here on this slide before I move on, over to the left here, these types of mating plans are going to see more inbreeding depression. We move to the right, we see more hybrid vigor. Now let's talk a little bit more deeply about line breeding. Line breeding can be thought of as inbreeding with intent if you want to put a positive spin on it. It's often used to concentrate those desired genes within animals that we want to bring up and make sure that they're fixed in the population. However, line breeding is often high risk and it can really be expensive. And it also should really be thought of something only to be taken on by genetic companies. The reason I say that is because line breeding typically results in more failures than successes. One example of that I want to show here is there's a very famous inbreeding experiment that was done at the USDA Miles City, Montana research station on Hereford lines. So in the end, they had developed 14 different inbred lines, and they were looking at inbreeding levels that were quite extreme, up in the neighborhood of 30 to 35% inbreeding is about the real maximum that you're going to experience with an intentional inbreeding experiment like this. But what they found in this Hereford line is really only about 2 to 4 of those initial lines really caught popularity and survived to the end. So they invested a whole lot of money in trying to create these inbred lines, but many of them will not exist and will go extinct because it's just too difficult to keep those organisms or those animals fertile and productive throughout their lifetime. But line breeding does have a place amongst commercial producers, amongst not commercial producers, amongst our breeding organizations rather. An example I want to show you here for hogs and poultry. It's like when you develop 2 different independent strains. So here's strain 1 of, let's say, a chicken organism. We develop inbred families as we go on down the line here. We can develop a second strain that's very similar as we go on down this genetic inbreeding line. And then as we go in the commercial population, we mate these 2 inbred strains together to create F1 hybrids and other types of hybrids for grow out. So inevitably today, when you go to your grocery store and buy a chicken breast or you buy a strip of bacon, you are buying pork and chicken from these hybrids that are grown out in commercial operations. And you're not really eating any attributable amount of meat from these inbred strains here. One advantage that line breeding does have is that it allows deleterious recessives to surface and be purged quite quickly from the population. And so our breeding companies will see that in these inbred lines and be able to eliminate those. But once we do that from the breeding company side, we don't see that come through in the F1 crosses at all. This is kind of a minor issue and not really something that I see our commercial producers being really involved in, both now and down the road, because we already know that the deleterious recessives we have in the dairy industry are quickly being purged due to the availability of the bulls that we have today. So coming back to this continuum again, now I want to get into some of the issues around these within breed matings here and the whole inbreeding topic. So let's move on to that. We know that inbreeding is an issue that comes with pure breeding, and of course we expect it because the goal of our genetic selection is to concentrate genes that are desired in the population. So what I'm saying is that in a lot of cases, a little bit of inbreeding is a good thing. We're moving towards the desired breeding goal. And by doing so, we remove that undesirable variation that exists in the population. However, we know that selection can be too concentrated if we move too fast towards a very narrow breeding goal. Geneticists like to call this phenomenon high selection differential. It means we put too much emphasis on a certain sire or dam family because we're chasing a very, very narrow breeding goal without variety and consideration for the entire span of traits that are going to lead us to profitability. An example of this that I'm showing in the photo here is English Bulldogs. So for example, they've chased a trait in their phenotypic goal here that has led to this problem with their face, change in their face structure and a health problem that comes with it. And the downfall is that in these bulldogs, now that trait has become fixed. So that's why people are concerned that that health problem will not improve. So it's an extreme example, yes, but an example in a different type of animal and breed that we need to be aware of that could happen and is happening in dairy cattle today. So we need to think about then, what will be the allelic variation that's needed for the future, because we don't always know what the future will hold. There are some consequences that will show up by a reduction of genetic diversity. And I'm going to outline 3 here. The first one is decreased fitness. So by this, I just simply mean animals and dairy cattle will see a reduction in fertility and health with inbreeding depression. And we see this in a lot of other traits, in a lot of other organisms, I mean. In this maize example here, we're seeing a decrease in fitness in terms of height of plant as the inbreeding is increasing. So that's an example of where decreasing function is taking hold. Another consequence we will see and experience is genetic defects, and some of them will be lethal. Some of them will manifest in the form of these specific alleles that we will purge out of the population too, and they will cause things like abortions and stillbirths. We already know about many of them, but there are more, and lots more will surface with time. Some will also be just random congenital defects. And in case you didn't notice, this calf I'm showing here was born without an ear. So that's an example of a congenital defect that we will expect to see pop up more and more with rises in inbreeding. A third way that we expect to see consequences of inbreeding: reduced additive genetic variance. So this is often, this is always probably considered the lagging indicator of reduction of genetic variation. So I often hear people say, inbreeding is not a problem. Look at all this progress we're making in our pure breeds. We haven't lost the ability to conduct effective selection. Well, is that really a thing we want to wait to happen? Because if we wait for that point, when there's no more genetic variance to be had, gosh, guys, we're really in trouble by the time we hit that point. So what I'm saying is we need to think about these things as breed stewards ahead of time before that point happens. One thing that we will see is slow and difficult adaptation to the environment. And we like to think of, excuse me, we like to think of this lush green example here of this perfect environment, but in reality down the future, sorry guys, we might end up having dairy climates where we have to function more in this environment down here. And in order for our populations to thrive in that environment, we're going to need genetic variants that can allow us to select for this type of dairy farming versus this type of dairy farming. Another example I want to talk about is, this was actually a study done in the UK where scientists looked at extreme inbreeding versus those without inbreeding. And in this case, they analyzed a human population that was above 10%, or in other words, highly inbred individuals who were more closely related even than first cousin inbreeding at 6.25%. And they compared those to individuals who had inbreeding lower than the first cousin level. And what they found in comparing those two different cohorts was that the highly inbred population had shorter stature, reduced cognition or thinking and processing ability mentally. They had lower fertility levels, reduced lung function, which gets at more of their health status. And then in total, when they analyzed all disease types, a 44% increased risk of disease. So all diseases combined together. So it's pretty amazing that we can track this and show it in humans as being a problem, yet we really haven't started to think about and address it in our dairy cattle populations. One interesting article that did show up in the US press just a couple years ago: most US dairy cows are descended from just 2 bulls. That is, in fact, the truth if you trace back our pedigrees to Chief and Elevation. They contribute all of the Y chromosomes that are found in the Holstein breed today. So that's what this article is getting at. Through our selection processes, we've basically taken out any other variants of the Y chromosome. And in fact, if you look at the relatedness of the breeds, these 2 bulls just dominate everything in the Holstein breed. And so, of course, if we think about that in a human context or any other type of organism, that is kind of scary to a lot of people. And that's why this type of topic made the news with the National Public Radio Network. Let's talk some more then about inbreeding coefficient. Now, inbreeding can be thought of the probability that different genes from the ancestor in common, so for example, the sire and dam, the probability that that same exact gene variant will be inherited in the offspring. So we like to sometimes talk about this in terms of a fixed cutoff, let's say 6.25%. That means 6.25% of the genes are exactly identical by descent from the sire and dam. Now we can use this inbreeding coefficient to measure the relatedness of the average individual in the population. And that's what I'm showing here in this chart of inbreeding coefficients of Holsteins with time. And in the US, we set our inbreeding base at the year 1960. So of course there was selection and inbreeding happening before then. It was maybe along the order of 2-3% inbreeding even before that 1960 data point. But then with time as we go along, you can see here we're ramping up selection, ramping up inbreeding, and then to the point here where we're getting to high levels of inbreeding during the 2000s years here. So for Holstein, yes, inbreeding has really climbed during recent years. And today we are at 8.69% in 2020, over 9% in 2021. You might wonder if this is a problem that is special in the US. And no, it's not, because Canada is right at the same level with us, as are many, many other Holstein populations across the globe. It's also important to point out that this might actually be an underestimate of the inbreeding level. We know that the data that the cows that make up this chart here are really only the tip of the population that has the best records. So they are the ones enrolled in milk recording and only account for about 23% of dairy cows in the United States. So therefore, they're also the population that's most likely to use planned matings and most likely to try to intentionally avoid those high inbreeding levels. Excuse me. So when we think about the rest of the population, yes, as an average, it's probably even higher than this. So for perspective then, remember first cousin mating at 6.25%. That's right about here. And we passed that level back in the around 2014, 2015, somewhere in there. And we're now approaching this 10% level. You might think that, oh, 10%, it's only a tenth of 100. And some people think that inbreeding could approach 100, but in fact it does not. If we mate 2 first siblings together, we get a 25% inbreeding coefficient. If we mate a sire to his daughter, we get 25%. And as I mentioned back in that Hereford experiment where they did these close matings over and over and over again, you can reach a level to about the mid to upper 30s, and that's about as high as you get. So really, if you think about 10% as a proportion of a maximum of 30-ish to 40-ish, we're actually quite high right now already on our inbreeding coefficients. Now, just to give you a context of where we sit in these different population measures and in different countries. Here I'm showing you inbreeding coefficients from pedigrees across different breeds and across some different countries. So in Denmark, Finland, and Sweden here in 2018, they were reporting a Holstein inbreeding at only 5.45%. And for the red breeds like Viking Red, 2.96%. So it is fair to say in this case that the red dairy cattle population, or Viking Red, is substantially lower than Holstein on inbreeding coefficient. And why is that? Well, in Viking Red, they have used other breeds within their program in more recent years than has Holstein. However, it's also accurate to say that these inbreeding levels are probably artificially low. We know that the Holstein breed in this country, in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, has a lot of the same gene pool as those across the globe. So in reality, it probably is closer to this level of the USA. The same can be said for the French Holsteins, who report at 4.8%, but we know genomically, we can prove it through genomics rather, that they are quite a bit higher than that on relatedness. So here in France, then, I compare Holstein and Montbéliard populations. Montbéliard is a breed native to France, and they sit at approximately the same level here on inbreeding. So not much difference there. In the USA example, now here we're reporting a much higher threshold of inbreeding going back to 1960. But here we see US Ayrshire, the red dairy cattle breed in the US, is somewhat lower than Holstein is for inbreeding coefficient. What about Holstein breeds across some other countries? Here I'm showing you the average increase in inbreeding coefficient by decade. So 1990 to 2000, we were increasing at this kind of pace per year over the course of the decade. So here we had Canada as the highest, but most of these other countries were increasing between 0.1 and 0.2. When we moved to the 2000s to 2010, we experienced a lower increase in inbreeding per year than the previous decade. But now, since the implementation of genomics into our selection, look at how high these increases have climbed across the years. So US and Italy, people often want to point a finger at them along with Canada and say, wow, you bad actors, you're really wrecking everything for all of us. But it's happening globally. These increases in inbreeding on an annual basis are quite staggering and too fast when we need to consider inbreeding levels at more like this level. So we might be steered to think that maybe Swedish and Danish Holstein is really doing a good job of breed stewardship, but we will have to see how that looks here on an individual level as time goes on. What we see here in a short-term picture could help them be sustainable in the long term, but the truth is, if you're going to participate in a global breeding program, you have to keep up with the trend of the breed, and it's hard to do that while trying to maintain low inbreeding levels. Let's think about the US example on a shorter interval scale here. So here I'm showing what happened from 2010 to 2012, a pretty low, modest increase in inbreeding per year. But then look at how it's ramped up and sped up just in the last 3 years. So yes, the generation interval has shortened, and part of that's going to cause this acceleration here in the post genomic era. We'll see these faster annual increases. but the rate that we have increased has accelerated even more than what we would expect to see from the pre-genomic years. Okay. So some geneticists will now ask, will our pace in inbreeding compromise the long-term genetic improvement that we want to see in our breeds? And will we be able to quickly adapt to the disease pressure or the rapidly changing environments and warming temperatures, lower rainfalls, what have you, that we expect to experience? We need genetic diversity to make that sort of those sort of changes as time goes on. Now, up until now, I've been talking only about pedigree inbreeding, or what we know based on familial relationships between cattle. And in this paper back in 2020, the author here decided, let's look at it on a genomic basis. So here they present the red bars here as the pedigree basis, but the yellow, green, and blue bars are the genomic basis. And what I'm showing here is rate of increase per generation, not per year, per generation. Okay. So on a generational basis, the FAO recommends at about a 0.5% rate of increase per generation is sustainable. At the very maximum, we don't want to see an increase higher than 1%. This leads to catastrophe, according to their models with the organisms they study. But look at the bars in relation to these two threshold points. We already see just the pedigree alone exceeding this rate per generation maximum, and these rates on the genomic inbreeding levels almost double, guys. So this should send up the red flags of, wow, we need to do something about the stewardship of our breeds, because this just isn't sustainable here in these recent years. The authors of this paper themselves went as far as to say the Holstein breed is at a critical effective population size, or that's another way to say critical inbreeding level, at which deleterious mutations may become fixed. That means when we see these bad mutations happening, we might not be able to breed them out of these breeds and populations. And that should really give us some pause. I want to talk about the economic consequences of inbreeding. So here are 3 studies that quantified this over the years. This latest one on the top here was just published this past year, showing a 24 €80 penalty per 1% increase amongst the Danish Holstein population, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, rather. We see very similar levels in other studies done in the USA here, a little bit older information. A €22 or $25 difference at the time I calculated this per 1% increase. Down here we used about a $24 increase per 1% of inbreeding coefficient. And let's do the math and then see how that calculates out to where we are today. So let's start out with that first example where we had €24.80 per 1% increase. If we assume that the DFS example of 5.45% pedigree inbreeding is accurate and not underreported, we can pencil out then that we have a lifetime penalty of about €135. And when we divide that out on a daily basis, we're really experiencing about a 14 euro cent per day daily penalty just due to inbreeding. We can do the same thing in the US, where the inbreeding level is reported to be higher, and using a US study. And when we do the math there, we see a 23 cent per day inbreeding penalty. And this is for every cow every day. So multiply that out across your herd, and we're talking tens of thousands of dollars in some cases, just due to this unfortunate increase in inbreeding that we've developed. Interestingly, some of the research studies that we've done in crossbreeding in the past, the one that I was involved in at Minnesota, we reported a difference between Holsteins and crosses of 34 cents profit per day, comparing the outcross ProCROSS that has the hybrid vigor to the Holstein, no hybrid vigor, and including this inbreeding depression. So you can think about, 34 cents a day is somewhat higher than this 23 cents. So about 17 cents of that is probably due to the hybrid vigor we're getting from crossbreeding. About, 17 to 23 cents of that is due to inbreeding depression. Okay, so what we're reporting in the data is both this whole inbreeding depression economic value plus the hybrid vigor. With that said, let me shift gears here and let's get into some discussion on crossbreeding. So the idea with crossbreeding is to limit inbreeding depression and take advantage of hybrid vigor at the same time. What is hybrid vigor and how do we measure it? Well, hybrid vigor can be thought of this advantage that I'm representing in the chart right here of the performance above and beyond the average of the two parents. So here we have, for example, in production level, a purebred parent of breed A, a purebred parent of breed B right here. Their parent average is this spot on the graph right here, but we see that offspring actually producing at this level here, 9,500 kilograms. So when we do the math on this difference here, we see a hybrid vigor level of 5%, or this much of the graph here is 5% of the total production in this whole bar. We can look at a different example here where we have higher levels of hybrid vigor for a different trait like fertility. And in the US, we often talk about pregnancy rates. So let's pretend that this breed A is Holstein here at 28% preg rate. We can pretend this breed B here is, say, Viking Red at 32% preg rate. But when we cross them and get this F1 cross, we notice that she has a 34% preg rate, better than both of the parents actually phenotypically. And this amount of difference here is equal to about a 13% difference when we do the math. Okay, so that's a trait that we expect higher levels of hybrid vigor or heterosis. Across organisms, we can expect hybrid vigor to really manifest itself in a lot of different ways. We can look at the quantitative traits like increase in size and yield, which I'm showing here in this photo of these two sheep. We notice the one on the left here is a bigger sheep than the one on the right, who would be the purebred parent breed. We can also think about traits like quality. And then we can think about physiological differences between organisms with more hybrid vigor. So that'd be things like resistance to disease, more fertility, faster maturing and growth rates, and then greater adaptability to the environment in which they live. Specific to dairy cattle, we can talk about hybrid vigor across a range of traits that we measure. Of course, production we probably measure the best out of all of these and in many different types of herd environments. But as production is a very highly heritable trait, it has the lowest hybrid vigor. So we see for production, we're at about maybe 3 to 5% expected hybrid vigor for that trait. We see much higher levels of hybrid vigor for these traits that, to be honest, are harder to measure, and we probably don't do a very good job measuring them. The reason I say that is because most of our genetic evaluation for health traits has really come on here in just the last 5 years, with the exception of the Nordic breeds who have been measuring health traits for several decades already. But the rest of the world hasn't really paid attention to these much until lately, because quite frankly, they're just very difficult to measure and across a wide number and range of cows and herds. But we do see more hybrid vigor for these fertility, longevity, and of course, total merit and profit. Now, a lot of these, we're still investigating their levels, and they change and they increase with time. So it's always kind of a moving target. But it gives you an idea of where we expect to see crossbreeding have the biggest impact. We can talk about ways to maximize hybrid vigor in terms of what kind of crossbreeding strategy we implement. So here I'm showing the maximum amount of hybrid vigor we can experience using a two-breed cross or a flip-flop method between two breeds versus a three-breed cross, and that's what ProCROSS is, a rotation of three distinct breeds. And then we can also look at a four-breed cross that incorporates an additional breed. The one thing you'll notice, and maybe one of the biggest reasons why we promote a three-breed cross, is because in this G2 or the second generation of the cross, we still maintain the 100% and high level of hybrid vigor in that cross. When you flip-flop back to one of the parent breeds after the first cross, you drop all the way back to 50% hybrid vigor. And this particular generation of this breeding scheme is quite disappointing. You also have to deal with then later on into these generations just an overall lower level and maybe disappointing level of hybrid vigor expressed in a two-breed cross. So that's why moving on to a three-breed cross, we see a big advantage here, a 19% increase in in hybrid vigor at stabilization here. And farmers really see and notice that in performance of animals. Now, if we consider the fourth breed, yes, we do increase hybrid vigor a little bit more, in fact, 7% more. But this fourth breed system comes with a lot of other problems. Namely, it's really hard to find a fourth breed that fits the environment very well in terms of breed complementarity. And another logistical problem is that you have to manage the pedigrees out to the fourth generation, and you have to manage a fourth breed of semen in your semen inventory. So overall, for the simplicity and combined with this hybrid vigor, most dairy producers find a three-breed cross to be pretty user-friendly, but also very advantageous in maintaining this high level of hybrid vigor. Now, every now and then I'll get questions about other systems for crossbreeding. And some folks I'll notice will promote this terminal system where we use a purebred, where we maintain a herd of purebred cows. We breed them to a different breed of purebred bull. So then we have some F1 cows in the herd. Essentially, then the dairy herd is made up of these two generations. A lot of pure breeds, a decent amount of F1s, who are then mated to a beef breed to produce terminal offspring. But this comes with a lot of disadvantages. When you have to maintain these purebred cows here, you really take the hit of the inbreeding on this generation, okay? And then in addition to that, you have the headache of having to manage inbreeding level in these cows too, okay? We also sometimes hear about composite breeding, and what is the argument for not doing a composite such as this? Here I'm showing a four-breed composite actually, where we have four parent breeds. We breed them together to create two different type of F1s. Then we breed them together to create an F2 and so on and so forth. Examples of composite breeds that you could think about that are relevant today include like the Kiwi cross in New Zealand, the Girolando in South America, which is the cross of the Gyr and the Holstein. Some problems here is that we don't experience nice and tidy passing on of genes in these 25%, 25%, 25% ratios. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of individual animal variation going on here that can be messy. And the hybrid vigor in this cross ends up declining with time. So it's really hard to keep these crosses at a high level of hybrid vigor. In fact, the maximum is 50%, and that's when you're doing a really good job of managing your composite breed. So a long ways from the advantages we see with a 3-breed cross. Another question I often get then is, Holstein is making such fast genetic progress, but why should I crossbreed if Holstein is doing so well? In fact, what we want to think about is to utilize all those things together. So yes, Holstein can make really good genetic progress and in a fast way. So let's harness that. Let's use the progressive selection that we're doing within the pure breeds, managed by our bull studs and by our progressive pure breeders. But we're going to combine that with other tools we have in our toolbox. So yes, we're going to manage our herds the best we can. We're going to invest in good facilities and in good animal husbandry. And let's consider the third leg of this stool. We should harness hybrid vigor in combination with these other two things. Hybrid vigor is our free gift. So why not include that in our total management package and use that? I want to show an example here of how we expect hybrid vigor to work jointly with selection and how we expect it to perform over time, and why this idea of increasing hybrid vigor is so relevant today. In this first line here, I'm just showing you what happens over time in performance if we do no selection and we manage a closed herd of cattle, no improvement, and we're not using crossbreeding. But then what if we use crossbreeding in this population to harness hybrid vigor? Well, we would expect to see an increase in performance, obviously, through the advantages of hybrid vigor, okay, but no improvement with time. Now let's consider the example where we have breed A, where we select within that breed, so we are in fact seeing increased performance with time. Then in breed B, we're also seeing similar increase in performance with time. And we can consider that mid-parent average as being halfway between the two in the same way. But again, these lines here does not consider the feature of any hybrid vigor in effect here. We're just talking about pure breeds and their mid-parent average. But now in comes crossbreeding with the hybrid vigor. So you'll see in the early years where the two parent breeds down here were very unrelated within breed and unrelated to each other, we didn't experience quite as much hybrid vigor. But now as we move out here in time and with more selection within the pure breeds, we're going to experience higher levels of hybrid vigor as time goes on. And that's what this red line is showing, an increase in slope that represents even more hybrid vigor as time proceeds. So today you can think about us being somewhere probably out in this zone where this red line represents a cow that is more profitable than our best pure breed. And that's what we're showing in all of the research studies today, is that ProCROSS does in fact perform with more profit than the pure breeds parents we consider, and particularly in comparison to Holstein. That hasn't always been the case, and you might suspect that maybe back in the 80s or 90s, we were back here where Holstein was the superior breed to any type of cross, and I would not contest that opinion. But now with recent experiments in crossbreeding, we know we're out here, and we know that the hybrid vigor we're receiving from this type of cross is gaining steam with time. We already see this in so many other organisms that I've already talked about. The biggest one probably relevant to agriculture is in maize or corn production. We know we have parents such as these on the left and right who, yes, they perform, they provide grain that we need, but gosh, when we cross them, we can get something much, much better than any of the parent generations that we consider. And this is what we really are moving forward with for commercial production. And dairy cattle is definitely headed the same way. So just to sum up here today, you'll see me give this slide in a lot of the talks I do, because I think these are the 4 main take-home messages that we need to consider when we talk about optimizing crossbreeding in commercial environments. So we want to choose distinct, pure breeds with sizable populations, and sizable populations allow them to impose progressive selection programs. We want to use breeds that complement each other well in their strengths and weaknesses. So with that, breeds that also fit the environment that we're considering, and then the milk market that we have too, of course. We recommend 3 breeds used in a rotation, and this maximizes hybrid vigor. And then lastly, only using the best ranking bulls within each breed. We can't claim to have a sound, suitable mating system when we're using maybe the good breeds, but we're using natural service bulls or the cheap bulls that we can get for $4 a straw. No, that's not the type of mating system that's going to optimize the profit and production and total outcome that we want with crossbreeding. So with that, I will end my presentation here, and I hope we have time for some questions. If you have anything after the seminar here, my email is here, and I'm happy to take those as well.
Thanks, Amy. That's great. Thank you very much. Currently, there are no questions in the question box, so you must have, maybe you've done such a good job, nobody's got any questions. But if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box or even into the chat, and I can put those questions to Amy. But currently nothing in there at the moment. Somebody is typing at the moment though, so let's see what comes in from that. Okay, so why does genomics increase inbreeding?
Yeah, so actually what's happening with genomics is we're doing a couple different things here. We're increasing the speed at which we're increasing inbreeding. So that's just a shortening of the generation interval. But also what's happening in genomics is that because genomics steers us towards the animals that are well represented in the population, we're actually increasing it that much more. So you're not going to, it's very hard to identify individuals that are both outcross because they don't really rank very high. And we're very good at saying, you know, instead of choosing across a breadth of pedigrees, oftentimes what our buying habits are doing is just steering us towards picking the best bulls right off the top of the list. And those happen to be the ones that are most related to the population because genomically they're the most widely represented in the top of the population. So it's really a double whammy effect that we're steering ourselves towards this same gene pool over and over and over again, and we're doing it at a much faster rate. Because you'll see if you're one of those types of farmers who analyzes the dams on these young bulls we're using, those dams are getting younger and younger all the time too. And we're just using so many more young sires today rather than proven bulls as we ever have been before. So that's shortening the generation interval substantially.
Okay, we do have a question. What is your response to genetic companies saying inbreeding in Holsteins is not a problem as genetic progress is outstripping this problem?
Yeah, so I hope I tried to make some of that clear in the presentation, but it's just not true. You know, we're ramping up inbreeding at such a fast rate. There's going to come a day when genes will stop assorting, and we see it in example organisms when we do these bench experiments that we run out of genetic variation. Are we there yet in Holstein? No, we're not. But like I said, do we want to wait for that day to show up, or are we better off practicing some breed stewardship now? And even if I set aside my advocacy for a crossbreeding plan, I really think anybody who's has any sort of involvement in pure breeding and in our genetic stewardship needs to really stop and think about are fast increases in inbreeding the best way to manage our breeds? And I think people with good, solid genetics training backgrounds will say, no, we really need to work harder at preserving genetic variability for the future.
Okay, another question here. Where is the research in ProCROSS going in the future?
Yeah, good question. Of course, we really try to target the practical traits that matter to commercial dairy farmers. So you may already be aware of the 10-year study I was involved in Minnesota that showed 34 cents or 9% higher profit per cow per day. And those kinds of profit studies are often the most interesting. However, the last couple of years we've been involved in feed efficiency. We just completed a study with the University of Padova in Italy where we looked at carbon footprint. And we now know, due to that effort, that ProCROSS cows have 4% lower carbon footprint per pound of milk solids produced compared to their Holstein contemporaries. 4%. So that's an example of a relevant trait that our consumers really care about, and our milk processors perhaps, because we need to convince consumers that we're doing the best job we can to be good stewards of the environment. In the future, I expect us to look at our crossbreeding program across different environments. That's definitely an interest to see where it's performing. We have a study underway in Denmark that's looking at ProCROSS versus Holstein there in the Danish system. Particularly, I'm interested in looking at heat tolerance too of our breed, because we get a lot of reports that ProCROSS are better for heat tolerance, and we should quantify that. I want to mention briefly that all of the research initiatives we do, I'm pretty sure I can say all of them are inspired by real dairy farmers experiencing ProCROSS in the field. So with that said, if you out there listening have ideas for things you want to see us investigate, feel free to speak up and let us know. We like to fund things that farmers themselves are interested in.
Okay, another one here. Would you recommend rotational cross over composite?
Yes, absolutely. So rotational crossbreeding with the 3 breeds, as I mentioned, maximizes hybrid vigor at an 86% level of the total, of the highest possible level. So that's pretty high. The maximum you will ever achieve with a composite breed is 50%. With a 2-breed composite is 50%. So that said, you'll never achieve the same level of hybrid vigor with any composite as you will with the rotation of purebred lines. So that's why ProCROSS, when it was developed, we've always said we know hybrid vigor's the most important thing here. Let's develop a plan that maximizes that hybrid vigor instead of trying to make our own composite breed that could result in more variation between animal to animal and also could lower the level of hybrid vigor.
Okay. I know there are other questions here, Amy, but obviously in the interest of time, as mentioned at the beginning, what we will do is we'll ensure those people that have asked some more questions that we respond to those accordingly. But obviously we're approaching the end of the hour session here. So I'd like to firstly thank you, Amy, for your time and giving your presentation, and for everybody who participated in the webinar. And as I say, we'll be sure to answer your questions that you've put through that we haven't had time to answer. So I'd like to thank everybody and say good evening.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.